at rte.ie/today with Sean O'Rourke.
Diarmaid Ferriter, Professor of Modern Irish History at UCD, is with me in studio. Diarmaid, I think I misused the word centurion. I called Kenneth Whitaker, I think he's a centenarian, not a centurion. But in any event, he's 100 today, and happy birthday and every good wish to him and his family. And again, he was somebody who was voted by RT viewers as the man of the century at the end of, I think it was 2001. Tell us about him.
Well, I think there's been an awful lot of discussion this morning about un-Republican conduct. I think one of the reasons why TK Whitaker is so highly regarded is because he's seen by many to represent the essence of good republicanism, a republicanism that's focused on the common good and the idea of public service in order to try and improve the lives of as many people as possible. That's what people associate him with, quite rightly. Now, we don't need to canonise him, and he wouldn't like us to canonise him. You know, he was no saint and he was affected by the prejudices of his era. But what he did have was a lot of the traits of that early generation of civil servants and public servants in the 1930s and the 1940s, with the crucial addition of imagination and a degree of defiance. And
unafraid to speak truth to
well, I mean, his biographer, Anne Chambers, has made the point quite rightly that if you look at some of the things that he was writing and saying in the 1950s, they did border on the insubordination, particularly in a very conservative Department of Finance. And he wrote about the finance attitude in 1953 while he was working his way up the ranks of the Department of Finance before he was appointed Secretary of the Department. And he referred to its inverted Macauberism, its stifling of initiative, its slowness to see the merits of the case for change. And the way he put it was, this department has to do some independent thinking. That doesn't sound revolutionary. That doesn't sound radical. But in the context of the Department of Finance back then, that's precisely what it was.
And even today, the idea of a 39-year-old civil servant being made a departmental secretary, it would be quite rare, very unusual.
Yeah, and I mean, there was no inevitability about it because Sarsfield Hogan was next in line for this job, and if you had been in keeping with the tradition of the Department of Finance, he would have got the job. But this is where politicians can make a big difference in who they choose to appoint, and it was Gerald Sweetman as Minister for Finance who decided that Whitaker had something different, had something exceptional, and it was probably seen as a gamble for some of the politicians at the time. But it certainly was a wise investment.
Indeed, and it might have been otherwise career-wise because as he told Carrie Crowley on his 86th birthday, he nearly didn't choose a career in public service.
I, in fact, was studying for an open scholarship to UCD when the letter arrived saying I'd got the job in the civil service. And then there was a council of war at home as to what I'd do, so I wasn't sure I'd ever get a scholarship, or continue to be able to fund my way through a medical course, which I had in mind. And the decision was to take the bird in the hand, and it proved all right. I mean, I sometimes indulged in Walter Mitty thoughts about when I'm passing the lighted blinds in Fitzwilliam Square, I said, there I might have been, but goodness knows what might have happened to me. Maybe as a psychiatrist I'd have done something naughty and be stricken off the rolls.
A wonderful sense of humour and self-deprecation there. And before we continue a conversation, just let's go and hear another of his recollections. He's talking here about the programme for economic expansion.
We were a young generation, a new generation of Irish well-trained, well-educated people, and we were at the heart of things in the public service, and there was a certain responsibility on us to do anything we could to pull ourselves out of the rut we were in. And there was a kind of Wordsworthian feeling about it, like bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. So everybody worked very hard, all my collaborators worked extremely hard with no hope of reward during the period we were working on economic development.
Now, you note there, Sean, the way he keeps saying we and us and collaborators, and he was always at pains to stress that of course it was known as the Whitaker Plan, but it was a team effort, a collaborative effort, and that was very important for him. He didn't want to be seen as somebody who was, working outside of everything that was there. And there were a generation there of public servants, civil servants, people like Tom Barrington and Paddy Lynch, and what the political scientist Tom Garvin has referred to as the developmentalists at that time. That's who he was talking about there.
Yeah, and essentially they were saying to the government, do a complete U-turn in your whole economic philosophy.
Yes, they were. And I mean, he's remarkably canny, T.K. Whitaker. I interviewed him 7 or 8 years ago about De Valera. And this was obviously, this change in direction was completely going against the whole ethos of the De Valera era in relation to economic protectionism and having a closed economy. And I put it to him that this was a radical departure. And I was essentially prompting him to criticise Eamon De Valera, and he was having absolutely none of it. He never lost that ability to be very canny and careful in what he said. But nonetheless, it's obvious that this marked a complete departure. What he had said was that it was pointless in sticking with a policy that had demonstrably failed. And he was very explicit about that. The question was, could you find a solution to that was economically realistic and politically palatable? And that's precisely what they came up with. But they needed people in place who would push it. And the reason he liked Lemass so much was because, in his own words, Lemass loved making decisions.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually about that particular thing. What Garrett Fitzgerald would have called a confluence of circumstances brought Lemass and Whitaker together.
Yeah. And I mean, again, timing is very important in all of this. And, Lemass was keen to push this because Lemass himself was in a hurry and he wanted to leave his mark. And I mean, you remember, Lemass had been back in industry and commerce in the 1930s and the 1940s. He was getting frustrated about the failures of economic self-sufficiency. But it was also about seeking the advice of economists. T.K. Whitaker was very influenced by Charles Carter, for example, who was an economics professor in Queen's University, who was pushing this idea of export-oriented growth, that you open up, you become a small open economy, that you create tax reliefs for inward investment, and that you begin to think about dismantling all of the walls that are there and the tariff walls. And the long-term game is also about making Ireland ready for European integration.
How important was he in driving that?
Massively, because he's laying the groundwork, with his collaborators. And what Lemass ends up doing in the 1960s is making a tour of the European capitals to stress that Ireland has to be considered for EEC membership. It didn't actually happen in the 1960s, but the groundwork was laid. And what he said, and it's important in psychological terms, nobody so loves us as to want us in the EEC on our terms. So we have got to show that we are capable of this. And he also said, it's often forgotten now, if this means that we're going to have to compromise on our political neutrality, on the whole question of the defence of the Western world, well, that'll have to be thrown into the mix too.
Mind you, the politicians have managed to pirouette around that one for the last half century or so since. But just, you mentioned about him not wanting to be canonised, and I had a text from somebody who's a keen student of history like yourself. He said to me this morning, let's not forget that Whitaker did not include the Marine in his programme for economic expansion. That became the basis for the European negotiations and resulted in a disastrous deal for Ireland.
There have been an awful lot of dissections of various aspects of the plan, of the programme, and weaknesses in it. And we have to be conscious of that perhaps to an extent the success of it was exaggerated. But I would say, if you were growing up in Ireland in the 1950s and the 1960s, and if you looked at what it meant immigration, an awful lot of people. Of course, there were weaknesses there.
And was that one of them on the Marine?
Yes, it certainly was. And I mean, and again, you mentioned there earlier on that, pirouetting around issues still. There are an awful lot of issues that were raised by Whitaker in the 50s and the 60s, and indeed in the 70s when he was governor of the central bank, about taxation, about incomes policy, about government borrowing, all of which still resonate today. Even in relation to, public sector pay and what the country can afford and so on. There's an awful lot of those issues that we have new versions of them now.
Born, of course, in County Down in Rostrevor, moved to Drogheda, I think, at the age of 6, and he was critically involved in, if you like, those early contacts between, well, they took their time, I suppose, in bringing them about, but between Sean Lemass as Taoiseach and Terence O'Neill. In fact, he had a great anecdote. We can hear some of it now. He's talking to Gabo on his 67th birthday about that journey with Lemass to Belfast for the meeting with O'Neill.
Henry was the name of the god who was driving him from Skerries. Henry hadn't been told anything about where we were going. So when I got into the car, Lemass took the pipe out of his mouth and said, "Henry, Belfast." Excuse me, Belfast. Poor Henry didn't think he had enough petrol to get that far.
Again, the humour just shines through there.
How do you get to Belfast? Well, it was so unusual. I mean, that was a serious breakthrough, and it was a thaw in the Cold War between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And of course, it was interesting for Whitaker personally, because he was born in Down. He was born into what became Northern Ireland, but still when it was a 32 county Ireland. And he moved south at a young age. But he had a personal relationship and a friendship with Terence O'Neill, and that was one of the abilities that he had. He was very good at establishing networks, and he was quite modest and unassuming about that, and he lacked an arrogance, but there's an integrity there. People trusted him. What becomes interesting towards the end of the decade and the outbreak of the Troubles is that he really wrestles control of Northern Ireland policy away from the Hawks. He becomes Jack Lynch's principal advisor on Northern Ireland. He drafts some of the most important speeches that were made by Lynch after the outbreak of the Troubles. And what he insisted on was that you could not react to the outbreak of the Troubles with emotion to the degree that it would create further instability.
And was he still in the Department of Finance at that stage?
No, he was moving at that stage to become governor of the central bank.
But still Lynch used him. He wrote a famous speech. I know you mentioned Anne Chambers, the biographer, a Tralee speech. What was the importance of that?
In 1969, the principle of consent, that it was all very well to aspire towards a united Ireland, but it could only be achieved by peaceful means and by cooperation between Irish people. And again, there was a temptation at the outbreak of the Troubles, for obvious reasons, to focus on the rhetoric of unity and, to become emotional about the whole question. It was a very emotional time. I wouldn't underestimate that for a moment. But he's there at the back of it all of the time, urging restraint. He also highlights what he regards as the need to get rid of Articles 2 and 3. He talks at various stages about the need to have an elected assembly in Northern Ireland so that you wouldn't leave the field to the paramilitaries. So he's taking control of that. He's quite advanced in his thinking in relation to the whole idea of consent, and you can see the genesis of some of what comes later there. But he had also, I think, a blind loyalty to Lynch. In that, he, as far as he was concerned, Lynch could do no wrong. And I mean, Lynch, there's a case to be made that Lynch was quite an indecisive leader around that time. But in relation to the public framing of the Republic's aspirations towards Northern Ireland, he does bring that critical influence to bear at a very, very difficult time.
Would he have cast a kind of a caustic or a cold eye on the three buccaneering young ministers of the era of the 60s, say Haughey, Lenihan and Donogh O'Malley? I don't think he approved entirely of the idea of the free education at second level. Certainly not the way it was announced.
He was absolutely furious. And again, this is where we have to be balanced about Whitaker. Whitaker is associated with making a daring initiative in the 1950s as a civil servant. But when Donogh O'Malley decided to do that as Minister for Education, he went ballistic because Whitaker said he didn't go through proper procedures. You can't be making an announcement that hasn't been costed, that hasn't been agreed to by the Department of Finance. So he was scathing in his criticisms. He agreed, he said, that it was a good idea, but he had to follow proper procedures. And of course, Donogh O'Malley knew damn well that if he let the cat out of the bag, it'd be very difficult to get the cat back into the bag. So it was quite a clever political strategy.
And was it Lynch with Taoiseach at the time or Lemass?
Jack Lynch was Taoiseach at the time.
And
Lemass was on his final lap.
And was there a sense that, look, he had given O'Malley the nod?
Yeah, Lemass indulged him. He was quite fatherly about it. I mean, he called Donogh in to give him a very gentle rap on the knuckles, but, he knew that this was going down very well with the public.
Actually, we've one last clip of Ken Whitaker that we can play now. It's again with Carrie Crowley on his 86th birthday, talking about Lemass.
Personally, he tended to be rather gruff, and he had very little use for small talk. Even when we were going up our first visit to Stormont, the conversation wasn't about ordinary things. I remember it was about the American Constitution and the separation of powers. So, he was a very serious man and very committed and a deep thinker, a man who was concerned about what was going to happen not just a week or a year from now, but well on into the future.
I suppose, Chairman, as somebody who derived some of his leisure from salmon fishing, he knew a lot about how to maybe cast his flies on the water or cast his bait to reel people in, how to deal with them, maybe subtly, and then at the right moment to strike.
I think that's a very good summary of his approach. What he found difficult and frustrating, particularly when he moves to the central bank and becomes governor of the central bank in 1969, is that he's not perhaps able to get politicians to do what he thinks they should be doing. And, you know, there was no love lost between himself and Charles Haughey, for example. And he really stuck the knife in when he was talking about Haughey when he was doing his interviews with Anne Chambers. And he said that he wasn't a true-blooded Republican. And, you know, Whitaker would often send Haughey memoranda, for example, that Haughey would say he'd look at. And then he wouldn't hear anything more about it, you know. But you can see the letters that he was writing as governor of the central bank. They're marvellous creations. It's great when the archives open up and you can see them. He would have written to Richie Ryan, for example, in 1974. And he said, look, my role as governor of the central bank is to be a warning light, is to say things that are unpalatable, and is to ensure that there's some degree of fiscal responsibility. And he said, as a community, we are living vastly beyond our means. And that was in 1974. And that, of course, is the phrase then that Charles Haughey was going to use at a much later stage in 1980. And, you know, there's a very clear logic. You cannot be spending money that we don't have. And when George Colley had a budget in 1972 that borrowed money for the first time for current expenditure, he said what the politicians are doing now is they're opening up this whole question of borrowing for current expenditure. They're opening up a gap that, for political reasons, it'll be very difficult to close again. So it's one thing, borrowing is not a sin if it's borrowing for capital and productive investment and expenditure, but this question of borrowing for current expenditure is going to
current
get into
budget
trouble.
deficit.
And what he said about the 1977 famous giveaway manifesto by Fianna Fáil was that it was a crowning folly, and the reason why T.K. Whitaker did not serve another term as governor of the central bank was because, in his own words, I could not be seen to condone policies that I fundamentally disagreed with. So whatever about Lynch, you know, and his
yeah, but it was Lynch presided over that
exactly.
77 manifesto.
So, I mean, of course there were limits to his influence, but he was somebody there. I mean, he could also be very withering. He was very funny about Richie Ryan at one stage, where he says that there's no point in Richie Ryan crying over spilt milk now, especially as he's licked up most of it himself. So you can see that spikiness that's there
wonderful.
all the time. You know, he had a lovely turn of phrase like that. So he has a very humane approach throughout.
Yeah.
And I think the psychological importance of setting targets and being seen to be disciplined. But he was also scathing about what he calls sectional interests. Whitaker was an admirer of what Margaret Thatcher did in Britain, and this is another way we have to look at him. He really believed, and you could see this when he's serving in the Seanad in the 1970s, late 1970s and early 1980s, because Lynch appointed him as a senator.
And Garrett reappointed him, didn't he?
Yeah, and he really admired what Thatcher had done in facing down the trade unions. And again, you've got to think about what the human and social costs were to that in Britain at that time. He's quite conservative in that sense, and he's a very strong law and order man as well. So again, you know, we need a rounded look at all of the various contributions.
Wasn't he Chancellor of the National University?
He was
of
Chancellor
Ireland
of the
as well,
NUI, and I mean, you were talking about prisons earlier on. You know, I mean, he authored a very enlightened report on prisons, the Whitaker report on prisons. So he did an awful lot of that in his so-called retirement, which was really nothing of the sort, and he was able to draw on his vast experience from the previous decades. But you can see that in the 70s and the 80s. He's really grappling with the whole question of fiscal responsibility and, you know, the danger of politicians being carried away by this competition in relation to public spending and trying to buy votes, essentially.
Diarmaid Ferriter, Professor of Modern Irish History at UCD. Thank you so much indeed for those observations now. In honour of Kenneth Whitaker on his 100th birthday, we thought it would be a good thing to do to play a piece of music of the theme of the century that's in it. Last Easter, you may recall, the RTE National Symphony Orchestra and a large gathering of choirs performed a piece called A Nation's Voice, 100 Years, a Nation at the National Museum in Collins Barracks. We bring it to you now in celebration of the life and times of Ken Whitaker.